Welcome back to the Path to Peace Therapy podcast. I'm Stephanie Buckley, AMFT, ADHD, and OCD specialist and family systems coach. Last week, in the first episode of our new reality case studies series, we intentionally did something a little different. Rather than beginning with the conflicts that most viewers associate with Amanda Batula and Kyle Cooke from Summer House, we stepped back and asked a much earlier question. We explored who Amanda was before Kyle ever entered her life. We talked about identity development, Bowen Family Systems Theory, differentiation of self, and the psychological importance of building a life that reflects your own values while remaining deeply connected to the people you love. Throughout that episode, I encouraged you to look beyond what reality television often highlights. Instead of focusing only on dramatic moments, we examined the emotional system that had been quietly developing beneath the surface for years. We talked about Amanda's successful corporate career, her transition into Loverboy, and the gradual process through which one person's identity can become increasingly intertwined with another person's dream. My hope wasn't simply to help you understand Amanda. My hope was to invite you to begin asking similar questions about your own life. Where are your roots? What parts of your identity belong uniquely to you? Are you continuing to grow as an individual while remaining connected to the people you love? Today, I want to continue that conversation, but we're going to shift our focus from identity to something even more fundamental. We're going to talk about the nervous system. If you've watched Summer House, you've probably heard people ask the same question over and over again. Friends on the show have asked it, viewers have asked it, podcasts have discussed it, social media has debated it for years. Why didn't she just leave? At first glance, that question sounds perfectly reasonable. If someone repeatedly disappoints you, breaks your trust, or creates emotional pain, why stay? Why continue hoping? Why continue trying? Why continue investing in a relationship that appears to be causing so much distress? The longer I've worked as a therapist, however, the more I've realized that this question often reflects how little we understand about the human nervous system. From the outside, relationships frequently look much simpler than they feel from the inside. Logic tells us one thing, while our attachment system, our emotional memories, our hopes, and our lived experiences tell us something very different. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about unhealthy relationships is believing that the decision to stay or leave is based purely on rational thought. Psychology teaches us something very different. Human beings rarely make important relationship decisions based solely on logic. We make them through a combination of emotional learning, nervous system responses, attachment experiences, family history, beliefs about love, previous experiences with loss, and the hope that tomorrow might finally look different from yesterday. That doesn't mean staying is always the healthiest decision, nor does it mean leaving is always easy. It simply means that before we judge someone's behavior, we first need to understand what their nervous system has been trying to protect. Throughout today's episode, I'd like to invite you to become curious rather than judgmental. Curiosity is one of the greatest gifts psychology offers us. Instead of asking, why would someone stay? We begin asking, what has this person's brain learned over time? What experiences shaped the way they now respond? What emotional injuries has the nervous system been trying to prevent from happening again? When we begin asking those kinds of questions, something remarkable happens. We stop reducing people to their behavior, and we begin understanding the emotional story underneath it. As always, I want to remind you that this series is educational. I have never evaluated Amanda Batula, Kyle Cooke, or any other public figure we discuss. I am not offering diagnoses, and I am not attempting to determine who was right or who was wrong. Everything we discuss is based on publicly available interviews, television episodes, podcasts, and statements made by the individuals themselves. These stories simply provide us with an opportunity to better understand universal psychological principles that many of us encounter in our own relationships. Because the truth is, this episode isn't really about Amanda. It isn't really about Kyle. It's about all of us. It's about every person who has ever found themselves asking, why do I keep responding this way? It's about every parent who worries about a child, every spouse who waits for someone to come home, every adult child who still carries emotional patterns from childhood, every person who has ever loved deeply enough to feel afraid of losing someone. And they all begin in the same place, the nervous system. The brain never starts from zero. One of the biggest mistakes we make when trying to understand human behavior is assuming that every situation begins with a blank slate. We tend to believe that people respond only to what is happening in the present moment. In reality, the brain almost never starts from zero. Every experience we have ever lived through quietly accompanies us into the next one. Think about the last time you accidentally touched a hot stove. Chances are you didn't need someone to remind you to be careful the next day. Your brain remembered for you. The next time your hand moved toward that burner, your body probably slowed down automatically. You may have become more cautious without consciously thinking about it. It was learning. The human brain is designed to learn from experience because its primary responsibility is not making us happy. Its primary responsibility is keeping us alive. One of the most important structures involved in this process is called the amygdala. The amygdala is a small almond-shaped structure located deep within the brain that functions as part of our threat detection system. You can think of it as your brain's smoke detector. Its job is to constantly scan your environment, looking for anything that resembles danger. When it detects a possible threat, it reacts remarkably quickly, often before your logical thinking brain has fully processed what is happening. This process is incredibly adaptive when we are facing genuine physical danger. If a child runs into the street, you don't want to stop and calmly analyze whether a car might be approaching. You want your nervous system to react immediately. That split-second response can save a life. The challenge is that the amygdala doesn't only respond to physical threats. It also learns from emotional threats. Experiences such as betrayal, abandonment, humiliation, chronic criticism, repeated disappointment, or emotional unpredictability can all become stored as emotionally significant events. Over time, the brain begins recognizing patterns. It quietly asks itself, have I experienced something like this before? If I have, what should I do to protect myself this time? This is one of the reasons I often tell clients that our brains create what I call history files. Every meaningful emotional experience is quietly added to that file. Then, when something similar happens again, the brain automatically compares today's situation with everything it has learned in the past. Imagine carrying a notebook with you every day. Every time someone breaks your trust, another page is added. Every time someone unexpectedly leaves, another page is added. Every painful argument, every broken promise, every emotionally significant experience becomes another chapter. Eventually, your brain begins reading from that notebook before you even realize it's happening. That is why psychology asks a very different question than the rest of the world. Instead of asking, why are you reacting like this? We ask, what has your nervous system learned? And I believe that question changes everything. Why hope can keep us stuck, intermittent reinforcement, and the psychology of staying. One of the questions that seems to follow Amanda Batula everywhere is, why didn't she just leave? It is a question that has been asked by viewers, bloggers, podcasters, cast members, and people commenting on social media for years. Yet the more I thought about that question, the more I realized it reflects something much larger than Amanda's story. It reflects the way many of us misunderstand human behavior. We often assume that if someone is intelligent, successful, and aware that a relationship is causing them pain, They should simply be able to walk away. If it were only that simple, therapists would have far fewer clients. Divorce would be much less common, and unhealthy relationships would end much earlier than they often do. The reality is that human beings do not attach themselves only to people. We also become attached to hope. Hope is one of the most beautiful and resilient qualities we possess. It allows us to survive grief, recover after illness, continue parenting through difficult seasons, rebuild after failure, and believe that tomorrow can look different from today. Hope is not a weakness. In fact, it is one of our greatest psychological strengths. The difficulty arises when hope becomes attached to a relationship pattern that never fundamentally changes. To understand why that happens, I'd like to introduce another important concept from behavioral psychology called intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement refers to a pattern in which rewards occur unpredictably rather than consistently. Unlike situations where every effort produces the same outcome, intermittent reinforcement keeps the brain engaged because the reward comes just often enough to maintain hope. Interestingly, decades of research have shown that unpredictable rewards are often much more powerful than predictable ones because the brain keeps anticipating that the next experience might finally be different. The easiest way to understand this concept is to think about a slot machine in a casino. If every single pull of the lever produced a jackpot, people would eventually lose interest because there would be no uncertainty. Likewise, if every pull resulted in losing money with absolutely no chance of winning, most people would stop playing fairly quickly. Slot machines are psychologically powerful because they operate somewhere in the middle. Most of the time, nothing happens. Occasionally, there is a small reward. Every once in a while, there is a much larger reward. The brain never knows exactly when that reward will arrive, and it is that uncertainty that keeps people engaged. This process is deeply connected to the brain's dopamine system. Dopamine is often described as the brain's feel-good chemical, but neuroscientists now understand that dopamine is much more closely associated with motivation and anticipation than with pleasure itself. Dopamine is released when we believe something rewarding might happen. It encourages us to keep searching, keep trying, and keep believing that the next opportunity could finally bring the outcome we've been hoping for. This system serves us remarkably well when we're learning new skills, solving difficult problems, or pursuing meaningful goals. Unfortunately, the exact same neurological system can also become activated inside relationships. Imagine two different couples. The first couple experiences consistency. They are kind to one another most days. They communicate openly. They apologize when they make mistakes. They repair conflict. Their relationship is not perfect because no relationship is, but their nervous systems gradually learn something very important. They learn that emotional safety is predictable. They don't spend enormous amounts of energy wondering which version of their partner is coming home, because they have developed confidence that today's interaction will probably resemble yesterday's. That predictability allows both nervous systems to relax. Now imagine a second couple. 1 week they feel incredibly connected. They laugh together, make future plans, express affection, and genuinely enjoy each other's company. Then something changes. A painful argument occurs. One partner stays out drinking. Trust is shaken. Communication breaks down. Emotional distance grows. Eventually, there are apologies. Tears are shed. Promises are made. The couple reconnects. And once again, the relationship feels deeply loving. For a while, everything appears better. Then another painful episode occurs, followed once again by remorse, closeness, and hope. Over time, the relationship becomes organized around unpredictability rather than consistency. Psychologically, this pattern is extraordinarily powerful. The relationship does not become difficult to leave simply because it is painful. If it were painful all the time, the decision might actually become much easier. What makes the relationship so emotionally binding is that the painful periods are repeatedly interrupted by moments of genuine love, tenderness, remorse, laughter, connection, and renewed optimism. The nervous system begins remembering not only the hurt, but also the incredible relief that follows when the relationship temporarily feels safe again. As I watched Amanda and Kyle's relationship over the years, I couldn't help noticing this recurring rhythm. Again, I want to emphasize that only Amanda and Kyle know the complete reality of their private relationship. We are observing publicly available interactions that have been edited for television. However, from what viewers repeatedly witnessed, there appeared to be a familiar sequence. Conflict would emerge. There would be conversations about drinking, trust, late nights, or emotional hurt. Eventually, there would be heartfelt apologies, visible remorse, emotional reconnection, and renewed commitment to moving forward together. Those moments often felt incredibly sincere, and I have no reason to believe they were anything other than genuine. From everything we observed publicly, I believe both Amanda and Kyle loved one another deeply. The challenge is that love and lasting change are not the same thing. Someone can sincerely love another person. Someone can genuinely cry after hurting someone they care about. Someone can honestly promise themselves that next time will be different. Yet if the underlying emotional system remains unchanged, the same circumstances often recreate the same behaviors. This is not because either person is necessarily being dishonest. It is because emotional patterns are often stronger than good intentions until new patterns are consistently practiced over time. This distinction is incredibly important because many people mistakenly believe that intense remorse automatically predicts lasting change. As therapists, we know that remorse is meaningful, but remorse alone is not treatment. Insight is important, but insight alone is not behavioral change. Lasting change requires something much more difficult. It requires repetition, accountability, emotional regulation, new coping skills, consistent follow-through. In other words, the nervous system must learn a different dance. One of the things that strikes me most about Amanda's story is that I don't believe she was simply attached to the relationship. I believe she may also have been attached to the possibility of what the relationship could become. Those are two very different forms of attachment. One is connected to the present, the other is connected to the future. Many people remain because they continue seeing glimpses of the partner they fell in love with. They remember the kindness, the humor, the affection, the dreams they built together, and the moments when everything genuinely felt possible. Those memories become emotionally significant because they reinforce hope that perhaps this time the pattern has finally changed. That is why I believe asking, "Why didn't she just leave?" is often the wrong question. A more psychologically informed question might be this: what kept giving her hope that staying might eventually lead to the relationship she had always believed was possible? Those two questions lead us in completely different directions. One assumes weakness. The other assumes humanity. As therapists, we are called to understand before we judge. We recognize that people are rarely making decisions based solely on the present moment. They are making decisions through the lens of everything they have lived, everything they have hoped for, and everything their nervous system has learned along the way. Once we understand that, compassion naturally begins replacing criticism. And perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons Amanda's story offers us. Human beings do not remain because they enjoy suffering. More often, they remain because hope continues whispering that tomorrow might finally become the day everything changes. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, and learning to distinguish between hope and observable patterns may be one of the most important psychological skills any of us ever develop. So now we've explored why hope can become one of the strongest forces keeping people emotionally connected, even when relationships have become painful. We've seen how intermittent reinforcement strengthens attachment, why the brain becomes invested in possibility, and why leaving is often much more psychologically complex than it appears from the outside. But there is still another piece of Amanda's story that I believe has been overlooked for years. As these cycles continued repeating, Amanda herself began changing. Viewers started noticing emotional exhaustion, reduced energy, piles of laundry, difficulty keeping up with daily tasks, and behaviors that many people quickly labeled as laziness. I don't think laziness is the right explanation. I think we need to talk about what chronic emotional stress does to the brain and body. Because before we judge someone's behavior, we first need to understand what prolonged hypervigilance, emotional labor, and nervous system activation can do to even the most capable person. That is exactly where we're headed next. When survival looks like laziness, what chronic stress does to the brain. One of the most difficult aspects of being a therapist is watching people judge the visible behavior without ever seeing the invisible burden that produced it. We live in a culture that celebrates productivity. We admire people who appear organized, energetic, motivated, and constantly moving forward. When someone begins struggling with everyday tasks, we often jump to quick conclusions. We call them lazy. We say they have no work ethic. We assume they simply aren't trying hard enough. Yet psychology has repeatedly shown us that behavior rarely tells the entire story. As I watched Amanda over the later seasons of Summer House, I noticed something that many viewers noticed as well. Conversations increasingly centered around piles of laundry, unanswered emails, clutter around the apartment, procrastination, low motivation, emotional exhaustion, and comments suggesting that she simply wasn't pulling her weight. Publicly, Kyle sometimes referred to her as lazy, unmotivated, or even a hoarder. Those words became part of the public narrative surrounding Amanda. Over time, many viewers accepted those descriptions as facts rather than asking a much more important psychological question. What happened to the person who had once successfully built a corporate career, managed deadlines at a global company, balanced two demanding jobs while helping launch a startup, and consistently demonstrated creativity, discipline, and professional competence? People don't usually lose those abilities overnight. Something else often changes first. This is where neuroscience becomes incredibly helpful because it reminds us that chronic stress changes the way the brain functions. It doesn't simply change how we feel emotionally. It changes how we think, how we organize, how we prioritize, how we make decisions, and even how much physical energy we have available to complete ordinary tasks. One of the first concepts I'd like to introduce is something called cognitive load. Cognitive load refers to the total amount of mental effort your brain is carrying at any given moment. Imagine your brain as a computer. When only one or two programs are open, everything runs efficiently. You can switch between tasks, remember information, and solve problems relatively easily. Now imagine opening 20 different programs at the same time. Suddenly, the computer begins slowing down. Applications freeze. Processing takes longer. It becomes difficult to complete even simple tasks because the system is already overloaded. The human brain works remarkably similarly. Every worry, every unfinished conversation, every anticipated conflict, every emotional responsibility, every future uncertainty occupies mental space. Individually, these concerns may not seem overwhelming. Collectively, they can consume an extraordinary amount of cognitive capacity. The more resources devoted to emotional survival, the fewer resources remain available for planning meals, folding laundry, answering emails, organizing paperwork, or remembering appointments. This becomes especially important when we think about another psychological concept called executive functioning. Executive functioning refers to a collection of higher-order mental skills that allow us to organize our lives effectively. These skills include planning, prioritizing, initiating tasks, regulating emotions, shifting attention, managing time, working memory, and following through on responsibilities. Many people hear the term executive functioning and immediately think about ADHD, because executive functioning differences are one of the hallmark characteristics of ADHD. However, executive functioning is influenced by much more than ADHD alone. Chronic stress also temporarily reduces executive functioning. When the brain perceives ongoing danger, it reallocates its resources. Survival becomes the priority. The nervous system is much less concerned about folding laundry than it is about monitoring emotional safety. This doesn't mean someone consciously chooses to ignore responsibilities. It means their brain has quietly shifted into a different operating mode. Imagine driving through a severe thunderstorm. The rain is coming down so heavily that you can barely see the road. Every ounce of your attention becomes focused on staying in your lane, watching the cars around you, and avoiding an accident. During those few minutes, you are probably not thinking about what you're making for dinner tomorrow night, or whether you remembered to organize your closet. Your brain has temporarily narrowed its focus because immediate safety requires your full attention. Now imagine living in that storm emotionally rather than physically. You still wake up each morning. You still go to work. You still smile at people. You still attend social events. But somewhere in the background, your nervous system remains partially occupied by questions that never seem fully resolved. Are we okay? What time will they come home tonight? Will another argument happen this weekend? Has anything changed? When will the next disappointment come? Those questions consume attention, whether we consciously realize it or not. This brings us to another concept that receives far less attention than it deserves, and that is emotional labor. Emotional labor refers to the invisible psychological work involved in managing not only our own emotions, but often the emotional climate of the people around us. Unlike washing dishes or paying bills, emotional labor leaves no visible evidence. Nobody congratulates you for anticipating another person's reactions, remembering difficult conversations, choosing your words carefully, monitoring the mood in the room, or mentally preparing yourself before bringing up an important topic. Yet these invisible tasks require enormous psychological energy. Think about an air traffic controller sitting inside a busy control tower. Their job is not physically demanding, yet by the end of their shift, they are often mentally exhausted. Why? Because they have spent hours continuously monitoring multiple moving parts, anticipating problems before they occur, and remaining intensely focused. Emotional labor functions much the same way. Someone carrying the emotional responsibility for a relationship may spend the entire day monitoring subtle changes in mood, anticipating conflict, deciding when difficult conversations should happen, remembering previous disappointments, and trying to prevent another painful interaction. None of that work appears on a to-do list, yet it consumes tremendous cognitive resources. As I watched Amanda over the years, I often wondered how much invisible emotional labor she may have been carrying. Again, I cannot know her private internal experience, and I don't pretend to. What I can observe publicly is that many conversations appeared to revolve around monitoring drinking, anticipating late nights, worrying about communication, managing conflict, discussing the business, navigating reality television, and carrying the emotional impact of public scrutiny. Whether or not every concern was objectively warranted is almost secondary. What matters psychologically is that the nervous system appeared to remain highly engaged for long periods of time. Eventually, every nervous system reaches a point where it begins conserving energy. One of the ways this sometimes appears is through what psychologists refer to as emotional exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion is not simply feeling tired after a long day. It is the cumulative depletion that develops when emotional demands consistently exceed the nervous system's ability to recover. People experiencing emotional exhaustion often describe feeling emotionally numb, unmotivated, forgetful, overwhelmed by simple tasks, or unable to begin activities they know are important. From the outside, others frequently interpret these changes as laziness. From the inside, the individual often feels frustrated because they remember being capable of so much more. One of the saddest aspects of chronic stress is that it gradually begins changing the way people view themselves. If someone repeatedly hears that they are lazy, disorganized, difficult, or unmotivated, they may eventually begin questioning their own competence. They stop comparing themselves to who they were before the stress began and instead compare themselves only to who they are today. This is one reason I found Amanda's earlier career so important to discuss in Episode 1. Her previous accomplishments remind us that we are not looking at someone who never possessed discipline or ambition. We are looking at someone who, at least publicly, appeared to be functioning very differently after years of carrying multiple emotional, relational, professional, and public responsibilities simultaneously. I often tell clients that the nervous system keeps score even when the calendar moves forward. Time alone does not restore depleted emotional resources. Rest requires safety. Healing requires consistency. Recovery requires the nervous system to gradually learn that it no longer has to remain constantly prepared for the next emotional storm. Perhaps that is one of the greatest misconceptions surrounding Amanda's story. Many people saw piles of laundry. Psychology encourages us to ask whether the laundry was ever really the problem. Sometimes the laundry is simply the visible symptom of an invisible nervous system that has been working overtime for years. So now we've explored what chronic emotional stress can do to executive functioning, motivation, organization, and emotional energy. We've begun understanding why behavior that appears lazy on the surface may actually reflect a nervous system that has spent years operating in survival mode. But there is still one important question we haven't answered. If Amanda's nervous system had become increasingly focused on maintaining emotional safety, what was happening inside Kyle's nervous system at exactly the same time? Because every relationship involves two people, and every emotional system has more than one story. In our next chapter, we're going to explore how shame, defensiveness, and emotional regulation may have influenced Kyle's responses, and why understanding both nervous systems is essential if we truly want to understand the psychology of staying. I actually think this will become the perfect bridge into Episode 2, Part B, where we'll shift our focus from Amanda's internal experience to the interaction between both partners' emotional systems. Before we end today's episode, I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions to reflect on this week. I call this the Path to Peace pause because my hope isn't simply that you understand Amanda's story. My hope is that you begin recognizing the emotional patterns within your own relationships, your own family system, and your own nervous system. Reflection. Question 1. When you experience uncertainty in an important relationship, what does your nervous system naturally do? Do you move closer? Do you send another text? Do you call? Do you over-explain? Do you become busy? Do you clean the house? Do you withdraw? Do you become quiet? Or do you convince yourself that you don't need anyone at all? Remember, these aren't character flaws, they're nervous system strategies, every one of them developed for a reason. Reflection, question 2. As you've listened to today's episode, have you found yourself judging someone else's behavior, or have you begun becoming curious about what their nervous system may have been trying to protect? Sometimes the greatest breakthrough in healing doesn't come from changing another person. It comes from changing the questions we ask. If today's episode resonated with you, I'd love to invite you to continue this conversation with me inside the Path to Peace Therapy Companion Journal on Patreon. This week's companion journal includes the remaining reflection questions, deeper clinical explanations of today's psychological concepts, guided journaling prompts, a Bowen Family Systems exercise, and practical tools designed to help you begin recognizing your own attachment patterns and nervous system responses. The public podcast introduces the concepts. The companion journal is where you begin applying them to your own life. You'll find the link in today's show notes. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. One of the reasons I created reality case studies is because I believe psychology becomes much easier to understand when we can observe real human behavior unfolding over time. These conversations are never about assigning blame or diagnosing public figures. They're about becoming more compassionate, more curious, and more psychologically informed as we examine the emotional systems that shape all of our lives. If today's episode gave you a different way of thinking about attachment, emotional safety, or the nervous system, I hope you'll share it with someone you care about. Sometimes a single conversation is enough to help someone stop blaming themselves and begin understanding the patterns that have been quietly shaping their life for years. Next time, we'll continue our Reality Case Studies trademark series by turning our attention to the other side of this emotional dance. We'll explore what happens inside the nervous system of the partner who withdraws. We'll examine shame, defensiveness, emotional regulation, and why remorse alone is rarely enough to change deeply established relationship patterns. We'll also explore why love and lasting change are not always the same thing, why boundaries sometimes fail despite the best intentions, and how two people who genuinely love one another can unknowingly become trapped inside a family system that keeps recreating the same painful cycle. Because before we judge someone's behavior, we first need to understand what prolonged hypervigilance, emotional labor, and nervous system activation can do to even the most capable person. And once we understand Amanda's nervous system, it's time to understand Kyle's. Until next time, remember this. You cannot change what you do not understand. But once you begin to understand the system, you stop blaming people and start changing patterns. And when patterns change, families change. Thank you for listening to The Path to PR.